Mona Lisa, or La Gioconda, painted by Leonardo da Vinci, is likely the world's most famous and valuable painting. Specialists at the Christie's auction house say that if it is ever put up for sale, the value of the artwork will, for the first time in history, exceed $1 billion. And that makes it the most expensive item ever to exist on our planet. For comparison, the cost of the Soyuz spacecraft is $20 million, while the Gioconda is worth as much as 50 spacecraft. The face of Mona Lisa is the most famous and most reproduced female face in the history of humanity. 80% of Louvre visitors come specifically to see her, and the Louvre receives 10 million visitors a year. That's equivalent to the population of Austria, Israel, or Belarus. Why is this painting so famous? How did it become a superstar of the art world, and why is it worth so much money? You may have heard that Mona Lisa's fame is due to her enigmatic smile or Leonardo da Vinci's masterful technique. However, that's not entirely accurate. Actually, Gioconda's immense fame is due to a different reason. This is the story of perhaps the most sensational and unbelievable crime ever committed in the world. This is the story of a perfect storm, when many factors came together at one point and created an information whirlwind that swept across the entire world. And it made the Mona Lisa the #1 star. In 1911, the Mona Lisa became the victim of an almost impossible theft. And now I'll tell you this story, perhaps the most incredible and scandalous story from the world of art. Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa in 1505, over 500 years ago. To this day, there is no single opinion about who is depicted in this painting. There are many theories, and one of them claims that his beloved Salai is depicted in a woman's dress. Supporting this theory is the clear resemblance between Salai and the Gioconda, and the fact that Leonardo bequeathed the painting to him. However, recently art historians have come to agree that the Gioconda is a portrait of the wife of the Florentine merchant Francesco del Giocondo, Lisa Gherardini. Florence is the place where Mona Lisa was born, and where she will return at the end of our story. After Leonardo's death, the painting was bought by the French King Francis. He paid a fabulous sum for it at that time, 4,000 écus. That's about 1.5 kilograms of gold. Today, that amount of gold would be worth around $100,000. That was the very first price ever paid for the Mona Lisa. Francis hung the Gioconda in his favorite room at the Encombe Fontainebleau in the bath, but don't think that this was a sign of neglect. The Fontainebleau bath at that time was one of the most important places in France. The king welcomed ambassadors and amused himself with mistresses in it. 100 years later, Ludovic moved the painting to the Versailles Palace. Only 300 years after its creation, in 1803, the Gioconda ended up in the Louvre after Napoleon Bonaparte kept it in his bedroom for 3 years. The Gioconda remained in the Louvre for over a century until an unthinkable event occurred. An event that became the main topic of all the newspapers and gossip around the world. For more than half a year, on August 21st, 1911, Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre. And to help you better understand how the subsequent events unfolded, I will tell you about the world and France at the beginning of the 20th century. This will give you a more complete picture of what happened next. And we will start with Gioconda herself. Until 1911, Gioconda was regarded as a masterpiece, but not especially famous. It hung in an ordinary spot among other paintings in the Louvre, and only a few art connoisseurs admired it. The public was unfamiliar with the Mona Lisa in that era. Not a single person in the world came to the Louvre specifically to see her back then. In the early 1900s, people's preferences differed from today. They preferred the beauties of Raphael, Murillo, and Titian. For example, Raphael's Holy Family was valued 10 times higher than Leonardo's Gioconda at that time, and the real star of the Louvre was the Assumption of the Virgin Mary by Murillo. It was this painting that attracted art lovers to the Louvre back then. Back then, the Louvre halls were often half empty, with very few visitors. Most Parisians lacked the resources, time, or interest to visit museums, as they had different priorities. As for art experts, even they at that time were convinced that the Mona Lisa was by no means the best work of the great Leonardo. Such works were considered to be the fresco, The Last Supper in Milan, or Salvator Mundi, for which the model was that very Salai, Leonardo's beloved. So let's begin our story on August 21st, 1911. On Monday, when the Louvre is closed, French artist Louis Barrault planned to work on a Mona Lisa copy. It was a common thing. Artists and students of that time often copied the works of great masters for practice or to sell them to tourists. Louis Barrault arrived at the Gioconda's usual spot in the hall around 8 ante-meridiem, only to find an empty space with iron pegs protruding from the wall instead of the painting. Annoyed, he turned to the museum staff, but they just waved him off, saying that the painting was probably with the museum photographers. This was common practice back then. Without digital photography, each print was nearly unique and could be used to create postcards or brochures. The prints were not durable, so paintings were often taken down from the wall to be photographed again. To simplify the process, even the most valuable paintings were hung on the wall using standard hooks. That's why none of the staff paid attention to the disappearance of the painting. They calmly went to find out who had taken it. Can you imagine? At that time, museum staff could easily, at any moment, take any painting off the wall and carry it away for their own needs. But neither the restorers nor the museum photographers could find the Gioconda. The guards became alarmed. But as you can imagine, no one is eager to report to the management that a national masterpiece was stolen during their shift. That's why they spent several more hours trying to find the painting before they finally decided to report it to the management. Just a year earlier, Théophile Moll, the Louvre's director, had boldly claimed that stealing from the Louvre was impossible. "It's like stealing the bell tower of Notre Dame Cathedral," he said. Soon he would be dismissed, along with all Louvre staff. Well, for now, the director can't believe the painting was stolen. That's why he doesn't announce the incident until the next morning, hoping it will still be found and the matter can be hushed up. The Louvre is finally closed, all employees are searched and questioned, but it's all in vain. By evening, the Mona Lisa's frame and protective glass case are found on the service staircase, a disturbing discovery. And only then did it become absolutely clear. The impossible had happened. The Gioconda had been stolen from the Louvre. A terrible scandal broke out. The Louvre was closed for 2 weeks, and all the evening newspapers in Paris came out on Tuesday with sensational headlines on the front page. "Sensation! The Mona Lisa has been stolen from the Louvre." And to help you understand just how phenomenal an event the theft from the Louvre was, I'll tell you about the world and France at the beginning of the 20th century. Here are a few key points for us to note. First, at that time, Paris was the world cradle of art and culture. Just 20 years earlier, the World's Fair was held in Paris, for which the Eiffel Tower was built as an arch. Yes, they just left it sticking out in the middle of the city. All the most prominent and talented artists, writers and actors flocked to Paris, settling in Montmartre, and tried to turn our understanding of what art is upside down. And the heart, the very center and repository of art in Paris was the Louvre. Despite many artists like Picasso considering museums as art tombs, the Louvre remained the repository of the French's worldwide collections. Over many years of conquests and acquisitions, in 1911, the Louvre was the largest, the most coveted, and as it seemed at the time, the most carefully guarded museum in the world. That's why the theft of the Gioconda sounded at the time like the disappearance of the moon, unthinkable, frightening, and wonderfully mysterious. Second, the situation in Europe was tense. Only 3 years remained before World War I. Mistrust and suspicion were rampant. Europe had split into 2 camps, the Entente, France, Russia and Great Britain, and the Triple Alliance. Italy, Germany and Austria-Hungary were the homelands of our Gioconda. Any more or less significant event in one of these countries was immediately perceived as an intrigue of one country against another. That's why the disappearance of Gioconda sparked a whole flurry of political speculation, immediately picked up by the newspapers, which only increased the commotion. Third, the early 20th century saw a technological revolution, with the 1910s being the era of silent cinemas flourishing. Movies became the most popular and fashionable entertainment of the time. Just 10 years ago, the first airplane was invented by the Wright brothers. The first automobiles are beginning to replace horse-drawn carriages. About 30 years ago, the first telegraph cable was laid across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean to America. And for the first time in human history, news began to reach America not in months, but in just a few hours. Newspapers had already learned to print photographs, and now people could see in them what the characters or objects being discussed actually looked like in reality. Telephones started appearing in many homes, and although having one phone per 250 people seems laughable by today's standards, but in those days it was a real revolution for gossips. The radio was invented before it became widespread a decade later. That's why newspapers were the only mass media of that time. That's why the photographs of the Gioconda were actually the first truly mass-produced photo in the history of art, and also why rumors and speculations spread around the world at the speed of sound. This news spreads globally for the first time through the latest inventions: telegraph, telephone, and automobiles. And for 90% of people on the planet, the photograph of the Gioconda becomes the first and only painting they have ever seen in their lives. Moreover, it's spiced up with a scandalous story. And last but not least, those were very naive times. People didn't have access to information like they do now, so they learned all the news from newspapers and gossip. You've probably seen old silent movies with exaggerated emotions where women dramatically get scared, faint, or fall into the arms of cunning villains. And people believed all of that. They experienced the news dramatically and pompously, standing at the crossroads of technological revolution and lingering superstitions. That's why the theft of the Gioconda gave rise to a whole array of incredible theories that people truly believed in. One such story, for example, was the tale that the Gioconda was stolen by a madman who had fallen desperately and hopelessly in love with the portrait. Reunited with his beloved, he cherishes her and refuses to let her go back to the world. According to another version, there was a secret society that worshipped Mona Lisa as a goddess and had been planning her abduction for a long time. In their secret hideout, they now worship her, conduct rituals, and offer sacrifices. Those were wild times filled with innocence, revelations, and worries. But most importantly, at that time, all the factors converged at a single point, and the theft of the Mona Lisa became a real sensational bombshell that swept across the whole world in an instant. And the press on both sides of the Atlantic literally exploded the very next day, with shocking headlines about the theft from the most important museum in the world. The world literally went crazy. Posters about Gioconda's disappearance covered Paris. Throughout the Louvre's history, lines formed, with 100,000 visitors in a single month, despite Paris having only 2 million residents at the time. People came to the Louvre just to look at the empty spot. In fact, this was the world's first successful performance art piece, the non-existent painting. Comedians joked that the Eiffel Tower would be next. For a whole month, the newspaper prints a reproduction of Gioconda on the front page. Songs about Gioconda come out and gain popularity. They ironically sing, "You can't steal her, we got her all the time except on Mondays." The face of Mona Lisa appears in advertisements for everything from cigarettes to corsets. Newspapers suggested a German conspiracy to steal Mona Lisa, aiming to humiliate France and expose its vulnerability. Germany accuses France of provocation as the countries belonging to opposing camps exchange threatening notes. This is all printed in newspapers and spread by salon gossipers. Mediums roll their eyes, predicting the world's end due to the loss of our Madonna. Visitors place flowers at the Louvre's empty wall, as if at a gravesite, and postcards featuring the Mona Lisa sail rapidly. In that same year, 1911, as many as 3 films about the theft from the Louvre are released, and all of them are hugely successful. And in 1912, a carnival was even organized in Paris in honor of Mona Lisa. Can you imagine what a stir this story caused? No other painting in the world, either before or after this story, has ever received such grand publicity as the stolen Gioconda. And we can see that it only worked to its advantage. Meanwhile, the Paris police threw all their forces into the search. The ports of France and the train stations of Paris are temporarily closed. All steamships, trains and cars leaving Paris and departing from the shores of France are being searched. Since nearly a day had passed between the theft and the announcement, some steamships and trains had already left. The Paris police contact all the countries of arrival, and those countries organize searches of the trains and ships upon their arrival. In fact, these were the first beginnings of Interpol. Even the liner of the great German Kaiser Wilhelm, which had so suspiciously managed to set sail a day before the theft, was arrested in the docks of New York and subjected to a thorough search a month later. Up to 60 police officers were assigned to the investigation. At the head of the investigation was a true legend of that era, a kind of Sherlock Holmes of France, Alphonse Bertillon. The public has no doubt. If Bertillon is on the case, it will be solved, and Bertillon energetically gets to work. First of all, he questions all the Louvre employees, both current and former, and discovers clue number 1. A Louvre employee saw a strange man on the service staircase on the day of the theft, dressed in a white work coat. He complained that the door he was sitting by didn't have a handle, and the repairman opened the door for him with his pliers. Bertillon showed the repairman photographs of all the Louvre employees, but none of them were identified. The detective orders a search of the surrounding area and a second clue is found. Near the Louvre, they discover a handle from one of the doors in a ditch. The picture of the crime becomes a little clearer, but it is still not clear enough. And then clue number 3 is discovered. On the glass case left from the painting, they find a fingerprint. Incredible luck! Fingerprinting, a newly emerged method at the time, had already gained universal recognition in all countries. Except for one, and that country was France. The thing is that Bertillon was the author of his own criminalistics method of identifying criminals by anthropometric data. Height, weight, size of ears, nose, and other data were recorded from all criminals and entered into special cards. This method was called the Bertillon method, and the famous detective hated the new, competing, and much more effective method with all his heart, and resisted it in every possible way. That's why France was the very last among all the major countries to start collecting fingerprints. They collected them on a residual basis, and their database was not very extensive or systematic. However, pressured by the public, Bertillon compared the fingerprint with the database and the fingerprints of all Louvre employees. No matches were found. Then Deritive conducts an investigative experiment and obtains evidence number 4. He hangs a mock-up of the painting on the wall and stages his theft to understand how it could have been pulled off. 3 police officers can't take the painting off the wall for 7 minutes. For 7 minutes they can't remove the painting from the wall. And then Bertillon concludes that a gang of criminals was involved in the theft. Gathering all this evidence, Bertillon creates the most likely portrait of the criminal. The detective believes the culprit is a sophisticated, intelligent, and wealthy art lover capable of appreciating the masterpiece's aesthetic value and planning the crime. To organize and finance such a daring and unbelievable crime, and at the same time leave no traces behind. It must be a criminal genius, Bertillon is convinced. And since the search among the museum staff yielded no results, Bertillon decides to look among all the companies that service the Louvre. Among them, they find a company called Gabi, which a year earlier had been installing glass cases for the most valuable exhibits. One of them was the Mona Lisa. It turns out that 5 people from this company worked on the cases and their installation. All of them were Italian guest workers. At that time, the French not only disliked Italians, but also didn't consider them as equals. They openly called Italians macaroni eaters and treated them as unskilled and cheap labor, the lowest and most despised layer of society. Gretelion realizes that these ragged people do not at all fit the image of a refined criminal genius. Fingerprints are taken from 4 individuals and from the 5th, Vincenzo Peruggia, who is not present at the scene. It turns out that Peruggia had already been arrested 3 years earlier for assaulting a prostitute. And the police have his fingerprints. They check, but the fingerprints do not match. Bertillon concludes that this is a dead end, but the police still, just in case, go to the Italian's tiny apartment near the Louvre with a search warrant. After quickly searching the room, the policemen leave empty-handed. The police hit a dead end. Even the great detective can't find a trace of the criminal. This only fuels the press even more. What kind of daring criminal, what kind of trickster, what kind of maniac, what kind of mad lover committed this crime? Writes the newspaper. The newspaper then decides to take on what it believes the police have neglected to accomplish. It offers a 40,000 franc reward to whoever returns the painting to the editorial office, promising anonymity. 40,000 francs. That's about $10,000 at that time, or roughly $250,000 in today's money, adjusted for inflation. In response, the rival newspaper Paris Journal announces an even higher reward of 50,000 francs or $320,000 in today's money. And that's the second highest price ever offered for the Mona Lisa. Can you imagine only $320,000 for the most famous painting in the world? Remember, I told you that if the Mona Lisa was ever put up for auction, its price would exceed $1 billion. So we got lucky. Recently, in 2016, a painting by our beloved Leonardo Da Vinci, Salvator Mundi, was put up for auction. The very one for which Salai served as the model. And it was sold at auction for a record $450 million, almost $500 million. Can you imagine how much art prices have changed? But back then, the reward offered for Mona Lisa sparked a new wave of rumors and schemes as people tried to get their hands on that very decent sum. Just so you understand, a worker's salary at that time was only $20 a month. To earn that amount, he would have had to work for 50 years, basically his entire life. And of course, the theft of the Gioconda attracted a lot of scammers and just people who wanted to get publicity from this story. All this allowed the news about the theft of the Gioconda to remain the #1 topic for half a year, until two incredible events happened on December 21st, 1911. 4 months after the theft, the first bank robbery in history using a car takes place, with the robbers successfully escaping from the police in the vehicle. And 3 months later, on April 15th, 1912, the Titanic sinks. Gradually, the theft of the Mona Lisa disappears from the newspaper headlines, and this continues for another 2 years until Gioconda once again becomes the main heroine on the front pages of newspapers all over the world. December 2nd, 1913, Florence, Italy, the place where Gioconda was born. Alfredo Geri, the owner of an antique shop in Florence, receives a letter that says, "The real Gioconda is with me. I want to return her." And the signature, Leonardo Vincenzo. The postmark on the letter indicates that it was sent from Paris. Geri, being an antique dealer, had seen many swindlers in his shop. That's why he doesn't believe it's true, but still replies to the letter and expresses his willingness to meet in Florence. Soon he receives a second note from the mysterious Lenardi, where he suggests meeting at the Tripoli Hotel, which is already in Florence. Alfredo Geri takes Giovanni Poggi, the director of the famous Uffizi Gallery, to the meeting so that he can verify the authenticity of the painting. A man invites them into a room and retrieves a painting wrapped in red silk from a wooden chest with a false bottom, hidden under dirty shirts, a mandolin and other junk. What the friends see looks very much like the real Mona Lisa. Giovanni Poggi examines the painting and recognizes the Mona Lisa by the marks on the back and the distinctive scratch left by a recent attack on the painting in the Louvre. The shocked friends realize that they are looking at the original. The thief demands 500,000 lira for the painting. That's about $100,000 at that time, or $2.5 million in today's money. You see how rapidly the Gioconda is increasing in value, even though the painting itself hasn't changed one bit. The friends persuade the thief to leave the painting with them for safekeeping while they gather the money, but then they turn him into the police. The thief was arrested that day. The revelation of the thief's identity sparked another sensation. The thief was revealed to be 32-year-old Vincenzo Peruggia. The very same craftsman who built the glass case for the Gioconda, the same despised Italian migrant worker in whose home the police had so carelessly conducted their search. The same illiterate macaroni eater who didn't fit the image of a refined criminal genius that Alphonse Bertillon had imagined. And Peruggia kept the Gioconda for more than 2 years in an ordinary wooden chest with a false bottom in a house just around the corner from the Louvre. You may ask, why didn't the fingerprints match? And the answer will surprise you. The Paris police made a fatal mistake and mixed up Peruggi's hands when they took his fingerprints after the incident with the prostitute. As a result, the fingerprint from the left hand on the glass was compared to the thumbprint of Peruggi's right hand. And all because Bertillon didn't consider fingerprints important and collected them for the records very carelessly. Whether it happened by accident or on purpose, considering Bertillon's dislike of fingerprinting, we don't know now. It's quite likely that, for the creator of the Bertillon system, the thought that a competing method could help solve a crime was unbearable. However, we may be witnessing one of the most ironic situations in history, when the arrogance and snobbery of detectives prevented them from seeing the truth that was right under their noses. So the thief has finally been arrested. During the interrogation, the cunning Peruggia declares that he stole the Mona Lisa out of patriotism, claiming he wanted to return the masterpiece stolen by Napoleon to its homeland. And although the declared patriotism doesn't really match the reward Peruggia demanded for the Gioconda, and we know that the painting was honestly purchased from Leonardo da Vinci, all of Italy admires the feat of a true patriot. Given how Italians were treated in France, this isn't surprising. All the newspapers in Italy are publishing photos of the handsome Peruggi, and Italian justice refuses to extradite him to France. In 7 months, Peruggi will stand trial, backed by the immense support of the Italian people. The judge, considering Peruggi's dubious patriotism, gives him a mere 1-year prison sentence. Peruggi's lawyers file an appeal, and the court reduces his sentence to 7 months, already served in detention. By that time, the famous thief is released right in the courtroom. Thus, Peruggi actually avoided punishment for the most notorious crime in the history of art. Years later, he will return to France and spend his remaining days there. After restoration, the painting was returned to France in triumph, following exhibitions in Florence, Rome, and Milan. The Tripoli hotel where the thief lived was renamed to Gioconda. The press started a new wave of Gioconda hysteria. Evening tours to the Louvre were organized for Parisian workers, but they turned into a pilgrimage to a single painting. People no longer wanted to see anything else. So, Mona Lisa gained superstar status, and since then the Louvre has remained the most visited museum in the world. How did an ordinary worker manage to commit such an unprecedented crime? How did he manage to steal a masterpiece from one of the most guarded museums in the world? You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. It was all shocking. Simply put, Peruggi, having experience working at the Louvre, knew that on Mondays there were no visitors and there was little security and few staff. He took a white staff coat with him and hid in one of the many storage rooms on Sunday, the day before the crime. On Monday morning, Peruggia waited until 7 o'clock, came out of the storage room and, unnoticed by anyone, headed to the hall with the Gioconda. There was no one in the hall. At that time in the Louvre, one guard watched over 2 or 3 halls at once, and on Mondays their staff was reduced even further. The guards frequently left their posts for personal reasons, such as smoking, having tea, or chatting with co-workers. The Louvre was almost empty. Peruggia easily took the painting off the wall along with its frame and glass case, covered it with his coat, and went out onto the service staircase. It was the safest way to get down to the exit of the building. There he removed the protective glass from the painting, leaving a fingerprint on it and the frame, and hid them on the staircase. Peruggia went down to the first floor to cross the hall and go outside, but there was an unexpected problem. The door from the staircase to the hall was locked. Luckily, he had a screwdriver and started unscrewing the door handle to open it. But then footsteps were heard from above, and Peruggia sat down on the steps covering the painting with his coat. A repairman comes down from above, the same one who saw the strange man on the stairs. Peruggia, acting as if nothing happened, complains to him that the door has no handle. Then the repairman uses his pliers to open the door and lets Peruggia into the hall. All that's left is to walk past the old soldier guard. But here, too, there's no one at the post. The thief calmly leaves the Louvre through the door, throws the door handle into the nearest ditch, and brings Gioconda to his apartment just 200 meters from the Louvre, where she will remain. For 2 whole years, right under their noses, under the nose of the Paris police. During interrogations, Peruggia said he was unsure which painting to take until the last second. He initially planned to take Montaign's Venus and Mars, but ultimately chose Gioconda. And do you know why? Yes, because it was the smallest painting in the whole, 57 by 77 centimeters. Imagine for a moment that a completely different painting was just one thought away from taking the place of the pop star in the art world, the place that is now occupied by the Gioconda. And this fateful choice was made not by museums, not by galleries, and not by art historians, but by an ordinary Italian migrant worker who simply chose what was easier to carry out. Now the Gioconda has her own hall in the Louvre. She is inside a special protective system that includes bulletproof glass, a complex alarm system, and equipment to create a microclimate optimal for preserving the painting. The cost of just this system is $7 million, which now protects the painting once bought by Francisco 70 times cheaper. Besides the theft, there were several more attempts on the Mona Lisa in 1956. On December 20th, a museum visitor poured acid on the painting and another threw a stone at the Gioconda, damaging the paint near the elbow. Following 2 incidents, the Mona Lisa was placed behind bulletproof glass. However, in 1974, at a Tokyo exhibition, a woman attempted to spray paint the canvas using an aerosol can. And on April 2nd, 2009, some crazy Russian woman, our compatriot who had not received French citizenship, threw a clay cup at the glass. Well, at least it was without tea. In 1962, the Mona Lisa was insured for $100 million, equivalent to around $800 million today. The museum management claims the painting is uninsured because it is priceless and impossible to insure something with no price. That sounds very beautiful. However, there are rumors that there actually is insurance, and it's an incredible $2.5 billion. That's how it happened, as a result of a random momentary choice by an ordinary Italian worker. The value of the Gioconda increased 2.5 million times. I hope you enjoyed this story. Next time we'll discuss Malevich's Black Square. You will only need 20 minutes to understand once and for all whether it really contains that very blackness of the cosmos, as some people say. Or is it really about something else? It will be interesting. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, but most importantly, leave a comment. What do you think is the value of Mona Lisa in her smile or in the hype she received at the beginning of the last century?